It's Monday, the 24th February 2025. Let's take a look at the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. First, the Punch newspaper. The leading story. APC. PDP clashes as El-Rufai woes opposition parties. Ruling party berates Kaduna ex-governor for romancing PDP bigwigs. Others, you can get all of this story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. And above the leading story from the left, tax reform. National Assembly engages caucus leaders as hearing begins. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. We have enough fuel to meet Nigerians' needs, says Dangote Refinery. You can get the complete story on page 52 of the Punch newspaper. Babangida justifies $12.4 billion Gulf oil windfall management, despite Okibo report. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Punch newspaper. Lagos Assembly. Tinubu engages Makinde, Osoba, others on peace mission. Miranda may step down. You can get the complete story on page 50 of the Punch newspaper. And below the leading story from the left, IG squaws man secretariat as Osun LG pool crisis rages. You can get the complete story on page 9 of the Punch newspaper. Stepfather, friend arrested for impregnating 14-year-old in Lagos. You can get the complete story on page 5 of the Punch newspaper. Southwest governments lack power to stop Sharia panel, says Kwara judge. You can get the complete story on page 9 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Nigerian Tribune. The leading story. Proposed taxes on free trade zone. $200 billion foreign investment may leave Nigeria. Nasima warns. Says over 600,000 jobs at risk. You can get all of the story on page 13 of the Tribune. And above the leading story from the left, how we gathered eggheads to manage Nigeria's economy, says IBB. Names: Aboyode, Nzimiro, Omolayole, Mabonguje, Okongwu, Fale, Kalu top economist, technocrats tap for economic agenda. You can get all of the story on page 21 of the Tribune. Adeleke swears in 30 Osun LG chairmen. Tells them to stay away from LG secretariats for now. APC rejects Osun LG pool outcome. Asks Tinubu to deny councils of statutory allocation. Don't truncate democracy. Makinde warns APC. You can get all of this story on page 21 of the Tribune. And below the leading story from the left, gunmen attack church, shoot pastor, abduct 6 worshippers in Delta. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the Tribune. Ogun to benefit as world's largest protein producer. Invest $2.5 billion in Nigeria. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the newspaper. 5 killed, 4 wounded in Edo over cocoa. You can get the complete story on page 5 of the newspaper. Fresh controversy over return of Obi as PDP South leader. You can get the complete story on page 22 of the newspaper. Ramadan. Consumer goods stock surges by 6.6%. You can get the complete story on page 12 of the Tribune. Moving over to the next paper, The Guardian. The leading story. A journey in service. Afterthought of the Maradona, say critics as IBB shares June 12 blame. You can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian. And below the leading story from the right, Nigeria may lose $200 billion FDIs, 600,000 jobs. Nasima warns as federal government taxes FTZs. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. 1966 coup. Ohaneze demands apology. 10 trillion naira compensation to Igbo. You can get the complete story on page 8 of The Guardian. And below the leading story from the left, Pope has mild kidney failure, remains in critical condition, says Vatican. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the newspaper. Concerns as Adeleke swears in newly elected council chairmen, councillors. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the Guardian. 2027, APC warns Tinubu of Southeast risk as Erufai seeks alliances to rescue Nigeria. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the Guardian. Lagos, Ogun to experience poor telephone services amid police. Nupeng stands off. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Vanguard, the leading story. APC, Makinde war over Osun LG pools. You can get the complete story on page 10 of the Vanguard. And above the leading story from the left, 1966 coup, IBB has vindicated Igbo. Ohaneze, Chekwas Okore. You can get the complete story on page 11 of the Vanguard. Ganduje, Minister Bika over Kanu APC chairmanship. You can get the complete story on page 13 of the Vanguard. Why I introduced SAP, other policies, says IBB. You can get the complete story on page 39 of the Vanguard. And below the leading story from the right, NLC to IMF, World Bank, stop lending money to unaccountable leaders. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. We have 600 billion naira worth of petrol in storage, says Dangote. You can get the complete story on page 43 of the newspaper. State of the nation. Why Nigerians are angry. Ango Abdullahi. Whether military or civilian regime, good governance is key. We don't need new states. You can get all of this story on page 14 of the Vanguard. No to scrapping of NDDC. Ishekiri leaders tell Tinubu. You can get the complete story on page 12 of the Vanguard. 2026 World Cup qualifiers. Setback for Chile as Super Eagles injury woes worsen. You can get the complete story on page 46 of the newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Daily Trust, the leading story. How federal government spent $8 billion to support Naira. Rewan. Nigerians yet to feel impact of rebasing inflation. It is not true. Presidency. CBN mom. You can get all of this story on page 4 of the newspaper. And above the leading story from the left, Minister threatens to leave APC over Kanu chairmanship. You can get the complete story on page 12 of the newspaper. We have over 600 billion naira worth of petrol in store, says Dangote. You can get the complete story on page 24 of the newspaper. Nigeria records 80 deaths from Lassa fever in 1 week. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the newspaper. And below the leading story, why we toppled Buhari, says IBB. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the newspaper. How cleric hypnotized killed students in Kwara. You can get the complete story on page 21 of the newspaper. North needs to align with South to rescue Nigeria, says Erufai. You can get the complete story on page 12 of the newspaper. After inauguration, Adeleke asked LG chairs to stay away from offices. You can get the complete story on page 5 of the newspaper. Moving over to the last paper on the list, Business Day, the leading story. Inside Nigeria's $20 billion yam industry, world's largest producer of crop, product exported to UK, US, UAE. You can get all of this story on page 31 of the newspaper. And above the leading story from the left, investment-starved Nigeria misses out on $3.7 billion metal boom. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper. And beside the leading story from the left, we have enough to meet Nigeria petrol needs, says Dangote. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the newspaper. Zure Oduwole 22 brings honor to Nigeria with Nobel Peace Prize nomination. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the newspaper. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, Do get a copy of the paper to read the complete story.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts on Facebook, Housing TV Africa, on Twitter, Housing TV Africa, Instagram, Housing TV Africa. Join the conversation and keep up with latest housing updates.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.